In the past several of these videos that I've been making about education, I've been going off about revolutionizing education, and I've touched on a lot of things. Today, I'd like to discuss some of my insights on one critical aspect of education that absolutely needs to be focused on if we are to ever revolutionize education, and that is assessment. Now, before we get there, let's look at education from the context of somebody who's trying to reform the system entirely. Now, if you look at the process of education, there are two parallel dimensions to it. One is the subjective dimension, the one that is focused on the student's well-being, the one that focuses on questions like what does the student gain from this process of education, and tries to look at education as something that is supposed to benefit the student. The other dimension of this whole thing is how education is supposed to benefit the society. This is the objective way of looking at education, where students are basically looked at as meaningful assets for the society, and it's the job of the education to ensure that these meaningful assets are brought to fullest usage and not let to waste away. Now, obviously, there's going to be some amount of clash between these two perspectives. Somebody who adopts the student-centric perspective may not feel that it is right for us to look at education while treating the student as an object, and others may disagree that it is the most practical way to look at education when you treat students as meaningful assets and we are trying to prepare them to be so. Now, the truth is that both of these are happening parallelly. It's not like one is happening at the expense of the other. Both of them are happening simultaneously and parallelly. And in fact, I would argue that both of these have to happen in recognition of each other. You cannot have just the student benefiting from the education and not the society, just as you cannot have just the society benefiting from education and not the student. Both of these parallel objectives have to happen simultaneously, or they may never happen at all. That's how it is. Because if you think about it, the society is entirely made up of the students, and you're not going to have a society that benefits from its students going through education if it happens at the expense of the well-being of the students. And similarly, you cannot have an education at all if the society is not benefited from the students going through education, because you need a stable society and a functional and prosperous society for education to happen unhindered. So both of these have to happen simultaneously and in conjunction with each other. Now, the reason why I'm bringing up this distinction between these two perspectives is that most of the times we end up taking the student's perspective on education and we look at the shortcomings of it by addressing the fact that students are not benefiting from this, and we miss out on the mechanistic nature of the entire infrastructure and where there are shortcomings. And I believe that if we are to reform the system, we ought to look at it from an objective standpoint as well. And so now let's look at what this entire machinery is all about. So here I have a diagram, and you can see that on the left you have human beings, and they go through this machinery called education, and they come out as human resource, which is basically building blocks for a better society and a better economy and all that. So if you look at it from this perspective, education is merely the conversion of human beings into human resource. And this sounds absolutely tragic and bleak, but this is the fundamental reality of education, and this is how we ought to look at it if we are to make it better with the intention of making it serve society in a better way. And it's only if you adopt this perspective of education, a lot of the things that go on today in the name of education begin to actually make sense. And I just also want to draw a parallel between the way education happens today and the farming industry. So if you look at the farming industry, there are some raw materials that are in play, like the seeds, the soil, the fertilizers and everything. And the farmers are the people who take up this raw material and convert it into produce, the final product. And then they sell their final product in the market, where people come and buy it in bulk, and the rate for the product is determined based on the quality of the product. And education happens in pretty much exactly identical ways. Here, the raw material are the students, and the institutions, the boards and everything, these are the farmers who cultivate the crop. And the final product is basically human resource, basically graduates that can be sold on the employment market for the customers, which are basically the employers, to come and purchase these final products. And the rate at which they buy these products depends on the quality of the graduate. So in a way, this entire educational machinery is very similar to the farming industry, where essentially the crop is a passive commodity that is being cultivated and sold for the benefit of the consumers. Similarly, here we have the cultivation of students who are being raised to pass through certain standards so that they can be sold in the employment market for higher pay packages. That is the way that we are approaching education, and it's not like this is wrong. Yes, it sounds really crass, but this is not exactly wrong. It has to happen in a way that is meaningful from a resource standpoint, because in the end, that's all society is composed of. It's composed of resources, consumption, and we have to look at things from an economist's perspective so that we can make systems operate meaningfully. And so this perspective is something that we can start off of in trying to reform the system so that it is configured in a meaningful way. So we saw the two parallel dimensions of education and the different points of interest of those two perspectives. And both of these perspectives have their own interests as to what the outcome must be. But they have a certain common point of interest, which is very critical to the way education happens. And that is assessment, or rather the methods that we use to assess and their effectiveness and their usefulness. And assessments have received a lot of criticism from all quarters, and some of the common complaints against it being that from a student's perspective, exams and scores and all these competitive exams are very stressful for the students, and a lot of their time goes into preparing for these exams, which takes away their involvement and excitement for education. And focusing so much on these exams and scores puts them in a point where a lot of kids are competing in scoring the highest on these exams. But if you look at the actual difference between somebody who scores at the very top and somebody who scores a little lower, there's not a huge advantage that high scoring gets you, other than the fact that you get chosen for being at the top rather than a little bit lower. So the actual tangible difference between somebody who scores at the very top and somebody who scores, let's say, 10 or 15% lower than that is not huge. It's just that in the context of competition, the person scoring at the top gets to win. And so while the competitiveness gives you a certain advantage, the actual competence is not something that matters a lot in the current forms of assessment that we have. In other words, it's basically that we have really saturated forms of assessment that don't really allow students to shine in meaningful ways. You're basically trying to cram 1,000 kids into performing in very limited number of dimensions that they have to be saturated in how they're able to express themselves, and there's not a lot of margin between the people who are at the very top. And the other thing is that there's a huge disconnect between actual talent and skills that a candidate has and the kinds of things that they have to do to score high in exams. It's not that if you're talented and you have a lot of skills and you have useful knowledge out in the real world, you can actually score higher in these exams. It takes a very specific kind of training to score high in these exams, and that training that you take to score high in the exams don't translate into useful talent out in the real world. And the other thing is, of course, that assessments don't actually offer an accurate analysis of what a candidate is capable of. It's in a way something that one must go through in order to differentiate themselves from a vast number of people who may not be as competitive. So you're basically just trying to prove that you're competitive without placing any stress on whether or not what you're doing to prove that is actually meaningful for you to be capable of. And so now we get to the point of what assessments ought to do. So let's say that assessments have some fundamental issues with them. So how must they be in order to be more effective? The first thing is that assessments should not be opinionated, as in they should not try to force somebody to be good at a very specific skill set implicitly by design. Assessments have to be very explicit about what it is that they're assessing and show an unbiased representation of the candidate's skills so that whoever is undertaking that assessment is able to come out with a review of where they actually stand, instead of it trying to force them to be good at something. It's not that education should never try to force somebody to be good at something, but it's not the job of assessments to do that. The reason why I'm making this point is that the willingness to be better at something, to be more competent in something, is something that should be arising from within the person who's trying to be better. It should not be forced upon them to be better at something just because having more candidates who are better at that thing is useful for the society at hand. So in a way, it must be the students who choose what assessments they go through so that they can try to organize their education at their will instead of through that of the people who impose education onto them. So it's a very minor detail that assessments have to be unopinionated, but it has a huge impact on the quality of education that the children undergo. And it offers a lot of freedom when the students are able to choose what it is that they must be better at and what it is that they want to show the world that they're capable of. The second thing is that assessments have to be multimodal, as in there are so many different modalities for an individual, and a lot of current generation assessment techniques revolve around being able to measure very specific, very narrow range of capabilities of an individual. And that is a huge problem. That is one of the most fundamental issues with assessment, in that they're not really assessing the entirety of the person. They're just assessing a very narrow segment of what that person is capable of. And it's been a fault of the tradition of just continuing to focus on assessing things that were relevant in the past generations rather than trying to reinvent assessment to reflect current necessities and possibilities. So expanding the number of modalities that assessments try to involve is very critical for well-rounded development of students. It's only when you include something into the assessment that it becomes worthy enough of receiving focus from the student. So we have to involve multiple modalities, multiple cognitive functions as part of the assessment focus so that it becomes important. And the third thing that assessments ought to do is bring a balance between measuring competence and measuring competitiveness. These are two different things. You can be really competent at something and still not be competitive enough because there are too many people who have the same competence. And similarly, you can have a lot of individuals competing for something, but none of them being actually competent enough at it, just because the amount of competence that something takes is very high. And even though everybody is competing with each other, they're not actually individually good at it to be competent enough. And a lot of what we're able to observe in the current methods of assessment is that a lot of it has to do with focusing on the competitiveness of an individual and not actually the competence. In fact, so many assessments are merely so ritualistic that the only reason why anyone would take them is to give themselves a competitive advantage over those who do not perform so well in it. And in a way, that makes the whole thing meaningless from the perspective of somebody who's looking for competent individuals. And if you look at the economic market, that's literally all that people are looking for. They're not looking for competitiveness as such. They're looking for competent individuals to help their organizations and companies grow. So there has to be a certain level of focus on competence, and we have to balance out the focus on these two so that we try to generate high quality graduates at the end. And assessments have to be open-ended because a lot of real world problems require that you allow somebody to think out of the box. You allow them to solve problems using novel approaches, and you allow them to use unconventional methods to arrive at a solution. And you cannot expect somebody to go through 20 years of education not being allowed to do that and then suddenly expect them to be really good at it when they have to encounter it after their educational careers. So education and assessments as they go through education have to inherently focus on having open-ended approaches to assessment so that individuals get to display their creative thinking, their ability to think out of the box. They're able to display their personalities basically, because all of these things matter in the real world. So why shouldn't they matter in assessments? And finally, assessment reviews must offer a standardized view of a very detailed look at a candidate's performance on various activities and projects and various other things across a vast span of time. If you look at the current reviews that are available, people are looking at their certificates, their reputation and things like that, but not actually getting a detailed look at what they were able to achieve through their many years of education. So from the employer's perspective, having reliable and standardized view of their portfolio spanning across many years of their education gives a very authentic representation of what the particular individual is capable of, what they gravitate towards, what they're interested in, how they approach problems, what kind of strategies they use to solve problems. All of these things ought to be available from their assessment reviews. Now, these points that I've listed here are just few that come to my mind, and these are subjective. But what is very critical to acknowledge here is that assessments are very fundamental to the way education happens, and it has to undergo a massive transformation in how it is approached so that assessments become relevant and can shape education in a very relevant manner. And let's say that we arrive at a way to effectively assess individuals, and that gets incorporated into education. What would happen? Well, the first thing is that we will reverse the trend of a large number of students going through education during the formative years, spending a large number of their hours doing meaningless things just to get through the hoops that they're being asked to go through. If you look at how things are happening right now, that's pretty much what it is. They're basically being asked to go through these meaningless hoops so that at the end they get a certificate which they're required to survive. So having proper assessments that are measuring relevant skills and allowing the students to actually grow as they undergo education could be a really important ingredient in making education relevant and meaningful. And also it's going to definitely create a certain excitement in the students when they get to express themselves through the full range of what they're capable of through their assessments. And when they are allowed to be at the helm of their creative self-expression, they're definitely going to spend a lot more effort and energy into shining in what they're capable of, instead of when they are basically being forced to do things that they may or may not be interested in. So having meaningful and open-ended assessments can bring that excitement. And of course, from the employer's perspective, it gives you somewhat of a lot more reliable and meaningful review of what each candidate is capable of, and they can actually finally give the right kind of importance to the right kind of candidates who have the necessary talent to support their organizations. So this whole video is just about emphasizing on the fact that we have a lot of work that needs to be done for education to become absolutely meaningful, and a lot of it can be achieved just by focusing on reforming the assessment methods to closely reflect the real world requirements in the age that we live in. I would love to hear your thoughts on this, so please post your comments down below in the comment section, and let's have a meaningful, engaged discussion about this so that we can have a meaningful impact. If you wish to support our organization, please make sure to like and share this video, and also subscribe to our channel, and you can also volunteer and donate to us through the links down below. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.